I was 23 standard years old when they selected me from the Terran Scholam artifacts. My hands were steady then. My eye was precise. I could render a human face in charcoal with enough accuracy that viewers would mistake the drawing for a pict capture if they did not look closely. The administratum assessor who reviewed my portfolio spent 4 minutes and 17 seconds examining my work. I counted. He said nothing during the review, his augmetic eye clicking and refocusing as he processed each piece. When he finished, he marked my file with the sigil of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet. The mark was red wax, pressed with a seal that bore the aquila and a designation number I did not recognize. He did not ask if I wished to go. The Imperium had determined my utility. Consent was not part of the calculation. I was given 6 days to conclude my affairs on Terra. 6 days to compress 23 years of existence into whatever could be carried or abandoned. My quarters were in the Urals Arcology, sub-level 47, a studio apartment of perhaps 20 square meters. The walls were unpainted rockcrete. The window, a narrow slit that qualified as fenestration only by the most generous interpretation, faced east. In the mornings, before the industrial smog accumulated to full density, you could see what remained of the mountains. Most had been mined away over the millennia, their substance converted to starship hulls and orbital plates. But a few peaks remained, gray and skeletal against the orange sky. I remember the smell of that apartment with absolute clarity. Linseed oil, turpentine, the chemical tang of fixative spray, the accumulated dust of ground charcoal, and underneath it all, the recycled air staleness that pervaded every hab unit on Terra. My mother had been a weaver, one of millions who worked in the textile manufactorums that supplied the Imperial Army with uniforms. She died when I was 11, her lungs finally surrendering to decades of fiber particulate. The administratum death certificate listed cause as industrial attrition, acceptable parameters. My father I never knew. The records listed him as Legion recruitment, 7th intake, no secondary data. He had been taken for Space Marine initiation and had either died during the augmentation process or survived to serve in a legion whose name I would never learn. The Imperium did not track such connections. They were irrelevant to function. I had one friend. His name was Thomas Verderer, and he worked in ceramics, creating decorative pieces for mid-level administrators who wanted art that demonstrated culture without challenging thought. We had studied together at the Scholam, shared meals twice weekly at a communal refectory 3 levels down from my apartment. His work was technically proficient, but emotionally empty. He created what was requested, nothing more. I did not judge him for this. Survival within the Imperium's creative apparatus required careful calibration of expression. Too much passion drew attention. Too little skill meant reassignment to labor corps. Tomas had found the acceptable middle. When I told him I was leaving, he nodded once. His hands were clay-stained, permanently discolored from his work. "Where?" he asked. "The Great Crusade, 63rd Expeditionary Fleet." "As what?" "Remembrancer." He understood what that meant. Remembrancers documented the Crusade's glory, traveling with military forces, recording compliance actions and the expansion of imperial territory. It was considered prestigious. It was also extremely dangerous. The mortality rate for embedded remembrancers was not publicly recorded, but informal estimates suggested 30% never returned to Terra. "That's significant," Thomas said. "Yes." We were standing in his studio, surrounded by partially completed ceramic pieces, bowls, vases, decorative plates bearing abstract patterns that meant nothing. He set down the piece he'd been working on, a small cup that would hold perhaps half a liter. "Will you come back?" he asked. "I don't know." He nodded again. He extended his hand. I took it. His grip was firm, his skin rough from work. We did not embrace. We did not speak further. I left his studio and never saw him again. I learned later that he died 7 years after my departure, killed in a HAB block collapse during a minor seismic event. The Imperium did not pause to acknowledge his passing. He was one of millions who died that year in construction accidents, industrial failures, and systemic violence. His ceramics were likely recycled or discarded. No record of his work survives in any archive I can access. The transit from Terra to the fleet staging point at Ulanor took 4 months subjective time, 8 months objective. I spent the journey in a berth designed for bulk personnel transport, a compartment holding 8 remembrancers in acceleration couches that converted to sleep stations. The space was 3 meters by 4 meters. We had 70 centimeters of personal storage. The air recycled every 40 minutes, acquiring a metallic taste that never fully dissipated. My companions were 3 imagists who worked in pict capture, 2 poets who specialized in verse commemorating military victories, 1 sculptor whose medium was reclaimed Jan Chang debris, and 1 musician who composed fanfares for compliance ceremonies. We were instructed in our duties by Proctor Chiral Venn, a woman of perhaps 50 standard years who had served as Remembrancer coordinator with the 3rd Legion during the cleansing of Laren. She was thin in the way that suggested extended periods of inadequate nutrition rather than genetics, her face carrying the kind of lines that come from witnessing events that leave permanent marks. She spoke with absolute conviction about our purpose. We were the Emperor's eyes, she told us. We would witness glory. We would record the truth of the Great Crusade so that future generations, 10,000 years hence, would understand what had been sacrificed to unite humanity under one banner, one truth, one vision of enlightenment. She showed us examples of exemplary remembrancer work, picked captures of space marines in battle, poetry describing the liberation of human worlds from Xenos domination, sculptures incorporating alien weapons melted down and reformed into imperial symbols. The message was clear. We were to document victory, demonstrate the necessity of the crusade, and inspire future generations to maintain the momentum of expansion. Objective observation was expected. Interpretation was not. I believed her. We all believed her. The alternative was to believe that the Imperium's violence was purposeless, that the millions dying across the galaxy were dying for nothing. We could not believe that. Believing that meant accepting that our own lives, our art, our carefully cultivated skills were in service to meaningless machinery. So we believed in glory. We believed in necessary sacrifice. We believed that what we would witness and record would matter. I met the 16th Legion aboard the battle barge Vengeful Spirit in the 3rd week of my assignment. The approach was conducted via bulk transport shuttle, a utilitarian craft that carried 60 Remembrancers, 300 Imperial Army personnel, and 40 tons of supply material. The shuttle bay where we docked was vast beyond my capacity to initially process. I had lived in arcology blocks, had seen industrial manufactorums, had witnessed the scale of Terran construction. None of it prepared me for Astarte's architecture. The bay was large enough to house my entire arcology block. The ceiling was lost in shadows 40 meters above. The deck plating was scored with millennia of use. The vengeful spirit was old, built during the earliest years of the crusade, and its every surface carried the marks of constant military operation. The temperature held at 15 degrees Celsius. My breath misted. The air tasted of machine oil, ozone, promethium, and something else I could not initially identify. Something organic and sharp that made the back of my throat tighten. I learned later that this was the scent of Astartes themselves. Enhanced metabolism producing chemical signatures that baseline humans registered as vaguely threatening. Artificial organs filtering and processing nutrients in ways that created waste compounds unlike anything normal human biology produced. The accumulated residue of surgical augmentation and chemical conditioning. They stood at attention in their ranks. 2 full companies assembled for inspection, and they were so much larger than human that my brain initially refused to process them as men. 2.5 meters tall in their armor. Shoulders broad enough that 3 baseline humans could stand abreast in the space one Astartes occupied. Their armor was unpainted ceramite, gray and polished, each plate bearing the maintenance marks of careful upkeep. They did not move. They did not speak. They stood with the absolute stillness of trained soldiers awaiting orders, and that stillness was somehow more threatening than motion would have been. The War Master himself greeted our cohort. Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the 16th Legion, first among equals of the Emperor's sons, the man who would lead humanity to its final victory over the darkness of old night. He was 3 meters tall. His armor was ornate without being decorative, functional embellishment that served to mark rank and inspire the troops under his command. His face was handsome in the way that classical Terran sculptures were handsome, too perfect to be entirely human, the bone structure too ideally proportioned, the features too symmetrically arranged. But close enough that you wanted to trust it. Close enough that when he smiled, you felt that smile was meant for you specifically. He told us we were welcome. He told us we would see wonders, would witness the unification of humanity across the stars, would record victories that would echo through 10,000 years of history. His voice carried warmth that felt genuine. Not the practiced warmth of a politician or the artificial enthusiasm of a propaganda servitor, but actual human warmth, the sense that he cared personally about our mission, about our safety, about our success. I wanted to please him. I did not question this impulse. Every person in that hangar bay wanted to please him. It radiated from him like heat from a forge. They assigned me to the 23rd Company, 4th Battalion. My handler was Captain Hastur Sejanus, who commanded with a reputation for tactical discipline and innovative void warfare doctrine. He was patient with me during those first weeks, more patient than he needed to be. Space Marines did not require patience with baseline humans. We existed to serve their mission, and if we failed to adapt quickly enough, we could be replaced. But Sejanus seemed to value competent assistance, and he had determined that teaching me properly would result in more useful documentation than simply demanding compliance. He explained legion organization, the structure of companies, squads, and fire teams, the distinction between line astartes and specialist roles, the hierarchy of command, and the protocols for inter-legion coordination. He walked me through weapon classifications, explaining the difference between bolter patterns, the applications of plasma and melter weaponry, the strategic deployment of heavy ordnance. He allowed me to observe training exercises, standing with me in observation bays while squads ran combat drills that would have killed baseline humans through sheer physical intensity. He answered my questions. This surprised me more than anything else. I had expected Space Marines to regard Remembrancers as necessary nuisances, to be tolerated but not engaged with. Sejanus treated my questions as legitimate requests for information. When I asked why a particular tactical formation was preferred, he explained the reasoning. When I sketched weapon assemblies and made errors in the technical details, he corrected my work with specific notes about load-bearing points and power cell connections. I sketched constantly during those early weeks. Anatomy studies of Astartes' musculature, attempting to understand how enhanced biology translated to physical form. Technical diagrams of bolter mechanisms, trying to capture the elegance of weapons designed for transhuman hands. Compositional studies of squad formations, learning to see the mathematical precision in their movements. I filled 3 sketchbooks in the first month, working with charcoal and graphite, occasionally using ink when I needed permanence. Sejanus reviewed my work each week. He would spend 5 to 10 minutes examining the drawings, occasionally asking questions about my artistic choices. Once, he corrected my rendering of a power pack connection. I had placed the feed line on the wrong side of the assembly. His criticism was accurate and delivered without condescension. I revised the drawing immediately. He nodded approval, a single sharp movement of his head. I felt absurdly proud of that nod, as if I were a child receiving validation from a parent. I did not examine this feeling closely. It was easier to simply be pleased. The first compliance action I witnessed was a minor frontier world designated 2715 in the cataloging system. The indigenous population had achieved early industrial capacity. Steam power, basic chemical engineering, rudimentary understanding of electricity. They had also achieved sufficient unity to present a coordinated rejection of the Imperium's offer of incorporation. When the Iterator delegation arrived to present the benefits of joining the Imperium, access to advanced technology, protection from Xenos threats, participation in humanity's grand unification, the planetary government responded by firing on the delegation's lander. 3 Iterators died, along with their support staff of 17 baseline humans. The rejection was absolute and violent. The 16th Legion's response was methodical and proportional. Orbital bombardment of military infrastructure, weapons manufactories, fortified positions, communication hubs. Precision strikes that destroyed capability while minimizing civilian casualties. The bombardment lasted 4 hours. 14 military targets were eliminated with an average civilian casualty rate of 11% per target. This was considered excellent discipline, well within acceptable parameters for limited compliance actions. I observed from a Stormbird's observation bay with 2 other Remembrancers, one pick capture specialist and one poet. The city below, I never learned its name, it was simply designated Primary Target Alpha, burned in sectioned patterns as the bombardment walked through defensive positions. The precision was remarkable. Each strike landed exactly where intended, the explosive force carefully calculated to destroy the target without creating excessive collateral damage. Buildings adjacent to military targets remained standing. Residential areas 3 blocks from weapon depots showed minimal damage. The Legion was not engaging in indiscriminate destruction. They were surgically removing the planetary government's capacity to resist. I drew the bombardment patterns, mapping the strike sequences, noting the careful spacing that prevented sympathetic detonations from creating uncontrolled firestorms. It was, in its way, beautiful. The application of overwhelming force with surgical precision, violence as art form, destruction as engineering challenge. I did not think about the people dying in those explosions. I thought about the technical skill required to achieve such results. I went down with the second wave. Sejanus permitted me to accompany his command squad during the consolidation phase, after resistance had been effectively eliminated, and the Legion was establishing control over key infrastructure. The Stormbird descended through smoke-darkened atmosphere, landing in a plaza that had been a market before the bombardment. The streets were rubble. Structural collapse had reduced buildings to angular debris fields. The air tasted of ash and cooked meat and chemicals I could not identify. Some combination of burned plastics, propellant residue, and organic decomposition. Bodies lay in patterns that suggested they had been fleeing when the bombardment struck. Adults, mostly, but not exclusively. Children. I observed children, small enough that their bodies seemed almost doll-like in the debris, their proportions wrong when rendered in death. They were burned, some to the point of being unidentifiable as human, others merely scorched, faces frozen in final expressions of terror or confusion, or that blank absence that sometimes accompanies instant death. I raised my recording stylus to document the scene. My hand trembled. The stylus point wavered, making marks I had not intended. I took a breath, attempting to steady myself. The tremor continued. Sejanus noticed. He stepped beside me, his armor still radiating heat from atmospheric entry, the scent of his transhuman chemistry sharp in my nostrils. "Record it accurately," he said. His voice was level, neither cruel nor kind, simply factual. "This is the cost of refusal. They chose this when they fired on the envoy. Their government chose this. We responded proportionally. These deaths are regrettable but necessary. Record them so that other worlds understand what refusal costs." I steadied my hand through conscious effort. I drew the bodies. I captured the angles of limbs, the textures of burned flesh, the way debris had fallen in geometric patterns across the intersection, creating a composition that was, despite everything, visually balanced. I recorded it accurately. I noted the estimated age of the children, between 6 and 12 standard years based on body proportions. I noted the blast patterns that indicated they had been caught in the open between structures with no shelter available. I noted the precision of the bombardment that had destroyed the military target 3 blocks away, while leaving enough of this plaza intact that individual casualties could be identified. Sejanus reviewed my work. He nodded approval. Good. This is the truth. This is what remembrancers exist to document. Not the sanitized version, but the actual cost. The Imperium does not lie about what it requires. That night, aboard the Vengeful Spirit, I could not eat. The protein paste provided in the Remembrancer refectory tasted like ash, like the air in that plaza. I forced myself to consume it anyway. The Imperium required my function. My emotional response was irrelevant to that requirement. I was a tool, a recording device in human form, and tools did not refuse operation because the work was unpleasant. Over the following months, I observed 17 compliance actions. The pattern varied in scale but remained consistent in structure. Contact, negotiation, rejection, or insufficient compliance, measured application of force, capitulation, or extermination. The 16th Legion executed their duty with efficiency that bordered on artistry. They did not inflict unnecessary casualties. They did not engage in random violence or undisciplined destruction. They applied exactly the amount of force required to achieve the objective, and when the objective was achieved, they stopped. I documented it all. My portfolio grew. Hundreds of drawings, capturing every aspect of the crusade. Astartes in combat, void warfare compositions showing fleet engagements, portraits of individual warriors, technical studies of equipment and fortifications, scenes of compliance and integration. Proctor Venn reviewed my work monthly and declared it exceptional. I was fulfilling my purpose. I was serving the Imperium's need for accurate documentation. I told myself this was sufficient. I told myself that bearing witness was meaningful, even when I witnessed horror. I met him during the campaign on Aureus Septimus. His name was Garviel Loken, squad captain, 10th Company, Lunar Wolves, the 16th Legion's original designation, still used informally by some of the older warriors. He was different from the other Astartes in ways I struggled to articulate. He questioned, not in the sense of refusing orders or doubting the Crusade's righteousness, but in seeking to understand the purpose behind each action, the reasoning that connected tactical decisions to strategic objectives. His loyalty was absolute. His faith in the Emperor's vision was unshakable. But he wanted to understand, not simply obey. He found me in the archive bay one evening, several hours into the ship's night cycle. I was reviewing my sketches of the day's engagement. The enemy had been a xenospecies, multi-limbed creatures approximately human-sized, with 4 arms and bilateral symmetry that suggested parallel evolution. They had fought with crude energy weapons, some form of directed electromagnetic pulse that disrupted electronics but was relatively ineffective against Astartes' armor. The Legion had killed approximately 4,000 of them with minimal casualties, 2 Astartes injured by falls during close combat. None dead. Loken stood behind me, observing my work in silence. I was accustomed to Astartes' presence by then, the weight of their attention, the slight vibration in deck plating when they moved, the sound of armor servo motors making micro-adjustments to maintain balance. I did not turn. I continued working on a detailed study of Xenos facial structure, attempting to capture the arrangement of eyes and mandibles with anatomical accuracy. "You draw them with faces," he said finally. His voice was different from Sejanus's, rougher, less polished, carrying a slight accent I could not place. Chthonic, I learned later, from the hive world where he had been recruited. I looked at my sketch. I had rendered one of the Xenos in detail, focusing on its facial structure. The three eyes arranged in triangular pattern, the complex mandibles that seemed to serve both respiratory and communicative functions, the texture of chitinous skin covering what might have been a skull, or might have been exoskeleton. They had faces, I replied. They were Xenos. They still had faces. He was quiet for a moment. The servo motors in his armor hummed, a frequency just at the edge of my hearing. Then, "Why does that matter to you?" I set down my stylus. I turned to face him. His features were difficult to read. Astartes' facial surgery flattened some aspects of expression, the bone structure modified to support enhanced musculature, the skin toughened against environmental damage. But his eyes were focused, intent. This was not casual conversation. This was genuine inquiry. Because if I draw them as monsters, I said carefully, I'm lying. They weren't monsters. They were defending their world from invasion. I'm here to record the truth. If I can't record their faces accurately, I'm not fulfilling my function. Loken sat. The chair groaned under his weight. Furniture designed for baseline humans was inadequate for Astartes' mass. The truth, he repeated. Do you believe the crusade is truth? I turned to face him fully. This was dangerous territory. Questioning the crusade's righteousness, even implicitly, was the kind of doubt that could result in reassignment or worse. But his expression suggested genuine question, not political trap. I believe, I said carefully, that I am here to record what I witness. The Imperium determines truth, determines what this all means, what purpose it serves. I determine accuracy, whether my drawings faithfully represent what actually occurred. Those are different functions. He almost smiled. The expression was brief, more a slight relaxation of facial muscles than true smile, but it suggested approval. A diplomatic answer. A survivor's answer. That did produce a smile, brief but genuine. Then we'll get along, Remembrancer. I'm Loken. I know who you are, Captain. Yes, but now I know you'll see faces. That matters. He paused, then added, What's your name? I told him. The name that I no longer remember, that has been lost to centuries of degradation and archival corruption. He repeated it once, committing it to memory, then stood. If you want to understand what you're recording, he said, ask questions. I'll answer what I can. He left. I returned to my sketching. My hand was steadier than it had been in months. Loken became my anchor. Over the weeks and months that followed, I sought him out when assignments and duty rotations permitted. He answered my questions about Legion culture, about the structure of space marine psychological conditioning, about the War Master, about the purpose of the crusade. His answers were thoughtful, sometimes contradictory, often surprising. He believed absolutely in the imperial truth, in the necessity of unifying humanity, in the elimination of Xenos threats that preyed on human populations, in the eradication of religious superstition that had kept humanity fractured and weak during Old Night. But he struggled with the methods. He questioned the necessity of certain casualties. He wondered whether some Xeno species might be reasoned with, might be contained rather than exterminated. He asked whether humanity's unity required such absolute uniformity, or whether some cultural variation might be permitted within the imperial framework. He never spoke these doubts openly in command councils or tactical briefings. His loyalty was absolute, his discipline perfect, but he spoke them to me in quiet moments, in archive bays and observation decks and empty corridors during the ship's night cycle. I drew him repeatedly. Studies of his face, his posture, the way he maintained his weapons with careful attention to each component. He tolerated my attention with what I interpreted as amusement, occasionally asking why I needed so many reference studies of the same subject. "Because you're still human," I said once. His expression shifted. Something like pain crossed his features. "I'm not human, Remembrancer. That's the point of the augmentation. We were made into something beyond human, something capable of achieving what baseline humans cannot. You question, you doubt, you try to understand. That's human. Or it's weakness. The War Master doesn't question. Sejanus doesn't doubt. They understand their purpose and execute it perfectly." "If it is weakness," I said, "it's the kind of weakness that might matter, the kind that prevents necessary violence from becoming unnecessary." He kept that portrait. I saw it later, mounted on the wall of his personal quarters, beside his weapons and his few personal effects. He never mentioned it again, but he sat for more studies. I accumulated a comprehensive record of Garvia Loken across 18 months of campaigning. His face from every angle, his equipment in various states of maintenance, compositional studies showing him in combat and in contemplation. I did not fully understand why I focused on him so intensely. Perhaps because he reminded me that humanity persisted even in transhuman form. Perhaps because I needed to believe that the Imperium's violence was guided by something beyond simple efficiency. The War Master was wounded on the world of Davin. I did not witness the injury. I was assigned to a secondary operation on Davin's moon when the War Master's inner circle descended to negotiate with the planet's war leader, a former ally named Yugen Temba who had fallen to some form of religious corruption during an earlier deployment. The details were fragmented and classified. Serious injury, poison or warp taint or some combination. Critical condition, unprecedented for a Primarch. The vengeful spirit entered high orbit above Davin. All operations ceased. The entire Legion held in stasis, waiting for word of the War Master's condition. Loken returned from the surface 4 days after the War Master's injury. He was haggard in a way I had never seen an Astartes appear haggard. Space Marines did not experience fatigue like baseline humans. Their enhanced physiology allowed them to function at peak capacity for weeks without rest. But Loken looked exhausted, the exhaustion of someone who had witnessed something that violated his fundamental understanding of reality. He would not speak of what had occurred on Davin. Not directly. He found me in my quarters, a small cabin assigned to senior remembrancers, 3 meters by 4, barely large enough for a cot and a desk, and stood in the doorway, silent, for nearly a minute. I waited. I had learned that Astartes processed information differently than baseline humans. Their enhanced neurology, allowing them to consider multiple simultaneous variables, but sometimes creating processing delays when emotional content complicated analysis. "Record everything from this point," he said finally. His voice was rough, strained. "Everything, you understand? No matter what you're told, no matter what seems." He stopped. He clenched his fists. His armor's joints whined with the pressure, servo motors struggling to manage the force he was applying. Just record it. Someone needs to know what actually happened. What happened? I asked. I don't know yet, but something changed. Something broke. The War Master. He stopped again. He looked at me directly, his expression carrying something I had never seen in an Astartes. Fear. Watch the War Master when he recovers. Watch and record. Promise me. I promise. He left. I sat in my quarters, my stylus in hand, my paper blank. I felt cold, though the environmental systems maintained standard temperature at 21 degrees Celsius. I recorded the timestamp. 004.M31. Davin's system, 5th day of the War Master's injury. I logged Loken's warning verbatim, his exact words captured in shorthand annotation. I began to understand that I was no longer documenting glory. I was documenting something else. Something that required testimony. The War Master recovered 6 days later. The event was announced shipwide through the General Vox system. Celebration protocols were observed. The crew allowed an extra ration of recaf. Duty shifts reduced by 2 hours, banners displaying the War Master's heraldry hung in primary corridors. I went to the Grand Assembly Hall where the War Master would address the Legion. The hall was massive, capable of holding 6,000 Astartes in full parade armor. The ceiling was 30 meters high, decorated with murals depicting the Great Crusade's greatest victories. I stood in the observers' gallery with other remembrancers and selected baseline human personnel, looking down at the assembled Legion. The War Master entered, and the Legion roared approval. 6,000 transhuman voices creating sound that was almost physical force, vibration I felt in my chest and bones. He walked to the central platform, his movements fluid and powerful, showing no sign of injury. He looked, I struggled to articulate what I observed. He looked like Horus Lupercal, the same face, the same bearing, the same 3-meter height and perfect proportions. But something in his eyes had shifted, something fundamental. The warmth I had observed during our first meeting, the charisma that made you want to please him, was gone, replaced by something else, a calculation that felt predatory, an intelligence that was assessing rather than connecting. He spoke of unity. He spoke of the Emperor's vision for humanity. He spoke of manifest destiny among the stars, of the necessity of the great crusade, of the glorious future that awaited those who fought with courage and discipline. The words were correct. The phrasing was flawless. The delivery demonstrated perfect understanding of rhetoric and emotional manipulation. Every Astartes in the hall responded with fervent approval, their cheering synchronized, their loyalty absolute. But I watched Loken. He stood among his company brothers in the 10th Company's assigned position, and he was not cheering. His face was rigid. His fists were clenched at his side. He stared at the War Master with an expression I recognized from my sketches, the look of a man witnessing something that violated his fundamental understanding of the world. The look of betrayal, not betrayal of loyalty, but betrayal of reality itself. I drew that expression. I captured it exactly, working quickly in the dim light of the observation gallery, using techniques I had developed for rapid field documentation. I archived it with the date and location. I noted in my records, the War Master has changed. The nature of the change is unclear, but it is absolute. Captain Loken recognizes this. Whatever occurred on Davin transformed something fundamental. I will continue to observe. The fleet departed Davin 3 days later. Our next target was the Istvan system. The briefing for Istvan 3 described a simple compliance action, routine by the standards we had established over years of campaigning. The system had fallen to religious insurgency. Emperor worship specifically, the exact form of superstition the imperial truth sought to eliminate. The irony was not lost on me. Populations worshipping the emperor as a god, and the Imperium responding by killing them for that worship. But doctrine was explicit. The emperor was not divine. He was human, enhanced and perfected, the apex of human evolution, but fundamentally human. Treating him as divine was regression, was the kind of superstitious thinking that had kept humanity weak and fractured during Old Night. Local government on Istvan III had collapsed completely. Anarchy prevailed, with various religious factions fighting for control, while the planet's infrastructure degraded toward failure. The imperial assessment determined that negotiation was pointless. There was no unified authority to negotiate with, and the religious fervor had reached levels that made rational discourse impossible. Military intervention was required. 4 legions would participate: the Sons of Horus, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, and the Emperor's Children. The deployment would be overwhelming, the outcome certain. Compliance would be achieved within 1 solar week, followed by standard reconstruction protocols. I was assigned to the initial wave with the 23rd Company. Sejanus had been killed during the Davin operation. I had not been informed until 2 weeks after the fact, the details classified at a level Omega. I missed the regular briefings, the patient explanations, the careful review of my work. My new handler was Captain Kalis Akaden, a warrior with the World Eaters before transferring to the Sons of Horus during a command reorganization. He was blunt where Sejanus had been thoughtful, practical where Sejanus had been educational. He tolerated my presence because remembrancers were required by crusade protocols, but he did not engage with my work beyond ensuring I did not compromise operational security. Loken found me in the embarkation bay the night before deployment. The bay was controlled chaos, thousands of Astartes performing final equipment checks, serfs loading ammunition and supplies, Mechanicum adepts performing blessing rituals over vehicles and weapons, the air thick with incense and machine oil. Loken pulled me aside into a maintenance alcove, a narrow space between 2 ammunition storage units where the noise dimmed fractionally. "You can't go down with the first wave," he said without preamble. "I'm assigned to the 23rd Company. Ekadon approved my deployment." "I know your assignment. I'm telling you to ignore it." I stared at him. Astartes did not suggest protocol violations. They were the embodiment of discipline, of absolute adherence to command structure. Loken suggesting I defy assignment was fundamentally wrong. "Why?" I asked. His jaw worked. He looked away, scanning the embarkation bay, then back to me. "Because something is wrong. The War Master's orders for Istvan. The troop deployments don't make tactical sense. Units that should be held in reserve are being sent in the first wave. Companies with questionable loyalty." He stopped. He gripped my shoulder, his hand large enough to encompass it entirely, the pressure just short of painful. "Stay on the ship for the first day. Record what happens from orbit. If I'm wrong, If this is standard operation, you can document the aftermath. If I'm right. He released me. If I'm right, someone needs to survive to testify. Testify to what? I don't know yet. But I know something is wrong. I can feel it. The War Master he's not himself. Whatever he brought back from Devon, it's not loyal to the Emperor. Please, stay on the ship. He left before I could respond, disappearing into the embarkation chaos. I stood in the maintenance alcove, my heart beating at elevated rate, my hands shaking with adrenaline response. I made a decision based on instinct and the accumulated trust of 18 months. I went to Proctor Venn and claimed sudden illness, possible contamination from contact with infected servitors during archival work. She was displeased. Pulling a Remembrancer from an assignment at the last moment created documentation gaps. But medical concerns overrode operational preferences. She reassigned me to orbital observation with 2 other Remembrancers who were considered too valuable to risk in initial deployment. I watched Istvan III from the observation deck of the Vengeful Spirit, a gallery running along the ship's dorsal spine with armored viewports providing direct visual of the planet below. The deployment proceeded according to standard protocol. Drop pods fell like rain, hundreds of them, ceramite eggs containing the Imperium's finest warriors. Stormbirds and thunderhawks followed in waves, their contrails creating geometric patterns in the upper atmosphere. The surface deployment zones lit with weapons fire as the planetary defense forces, disorganized, poorly equipped, but numerous, coalesced to resist the invasion. I sketched the patterns, noting troop concentrations, fire zones, tactical movements. For 6 hours, the operation appeared routine. Astartes forces established beachheads, eliminated local resistance, began expanding the secure zones in preparation for Imperial Army follow-up forces. Casualty reports were minimal. Perhaps 200 Astartes injured, 37 killed, within expected parameters for this scale of operation. Then the Vengeful Spirit opened fire on the planet. I was drawing a tactical deployment pattern when the ship's weapons activated. The sound was immediate and overwhelming, the deep bass vibration of lance batteries charging, the high-frequency whine of bombardment cannons cycling, the mechanical thunder of torpedo tubes launching ordnance. The observation deck's viewports automatically polarized to prevent retinal damage from the weapon discharge. Through the darkened view, I watched streams of energy and explosive projectiles rain down on Istvan III. Not targeted bombardment of military infrastructure, not precision strikes on specific defensive positions. The weapons targeted the deployment zones. Our deployment zones, where our forces were operating. I watched, my stylus frozen in my hand, as lance strikes and bombardment cannons turned the primary landing zone into flame. Explosive force sufficient to glass ceramite. Temperatures sufficient to vaporize adamantium. Directed at our own troops. The other Remembrancers in the observation gallery were screaming questions. A naval officer was shouting into the Vox system, demanding clarification from fire control, his voice cracking with confusion and horror. The bombardment continued. Ship after ship opened fire. Vengeful Spirit, Conqueror, Endurance, Pride of the Emperor. 4 Legion flagships, their full arsenals unleashed on the surface. The bombardment lasted 43 minutes. I counted. I recorded the timestamp. I watched through the polarized viewport as the surface burned, as lance strikes created new geography, as our own forces died under fire from their own fleet. When it ceased, the primary deployment zone had been glassed. Tactical displays showed surface temperature readings of over 2,000 degrees Celsius, conditions absolutely incompatible with any form of life. Estimated casualties appeared on the tactical board, numbers that climbed as the system processed sensor data. 74,000 Imperial Army personnel, 4,200 Astartes, our own forces, deliberately targeted, deliberately killed. I recorded everything. I sketched the bombardment patterns from memory, my hands moving automatically while my mind struggled to process what I had witnessed. I noted the ships involved, their firing sequences, the targeting patterns that indicated deliberate concentration on friendly forces. I documented the duration, the weapons employed, the approximate casualty figures as they appeared on tactical displays. I recorded it all because recording was the only action available to me, because my function as Remembrancer was to document the truth regardless of what that truth revealed. The observation gallery erupted in confused shouting. Remembrancers demanding explanations. Naval officers trying to reach command for clarification. 2 security personnel entered and ordered everyone to silence. Their lace guns held ready, their expressions suggesting they would enforce compliance with violence if necessary. We were informed that the operation was proceeding as planned, that what we had witnessed was classified. The discussion of the bombardment was prohibited until official briefing materials were distributed. The ship entered full lockdown 30 minutes later. All non-essential personnel confined to quarters, pending clarification of operational parameters. I was escorted to my assigned cabin by an armed serf who would not answer questions. I sat in my 3-meter cube on my cot that folded down from the wall, and I drew. I drew the bombardment as I had observed it. I drew the flames consuming the surface. I drew Loken's face from memory, the expression of warning he had given me in the embarkation bay. I drew until my hands cramped, until the pages filled my desk and spread across the floor, until the images burned into permanent memory, with the kind of clarity that would never fade regardless of how much I wished to forget them. I did not see Loken for 3 days. Communications were restricted, movement between sections prohibited, information flow reduced to official announcements via the ship's Vox system. Those announcements were carefully worded, providing minimal detail while requesting patience during ongoing operational complications. On the 4th day, partial lockdown lifted for essential personnel, and information began to leak through the informal networks that always existed aboard military vessels, regardless of official restrictions. Survivors remained on Istvan, the 3rd surface. Thousands of Astartes who had weathered the bombardment, who had found shelter or been protected by geography or simple chance, now fought in the ruins against forces sent to finish them. The survivors had organized under remaining command structure. They had fortified positions using destroyed buildings and crashed ships. They were fighting with desperate brilliance, inflicting casualties far beyond projections on the forces sent to eliminate them. Loken was on the surface, leading survivors, fighting with them against the War Master's forces. I learned this from Cinderman, an Iterator and Remembrancer who had served with the 63rd Expedition since its inception. He was old, perhaps 70 standard, his face carrying the accumulated weight of decades spent documenting the crusade. He found me in the archive bay where I had been permitted to return under supervision, supposedly organizing my documentation, but actually trying to understand what was happening. "You drew Loken extensively?" he said. "Not a question. A statement of fact verified through review of my archived work." "Yes." "Do you have copies?" "Multiple copies. Everything I draw, I copy according to standard archival procedure. Original, primary backup, secondary backup stored in separate locations. Hide them. Hide everything you've recorded since Davin. They're purging the records." He glanced toward the bay's entrance, confirming no one was in immediate earshot. His voice dropped to barely above whisper. "Anyone who witnessed too much is being eliminated or imprisoned. Remembrancers who won't swear loyalty to the War Master's new path are disappearing. I've counted 17 missing from our cohort. No explanations, no records of their disposition." My hands went cold. "What new path?" "He's rejected the Emperor. He's sworn himself to—" Cinderman stopped. He looked genuinely frightened, an expression that seemed wrong on someone who had documented military operations for decades. "There are powers in the warp, old powers. The Emperor banned religious worship because worship gives those powers strength. The War Master has embraced them. He's turned traitor, and he's taking half the legions with him." The words made no sense. The War Master was the Emperor's chosen son, the architect of the Crusade's greatest victories. The idea that he would betray the Imperium was fundamentally incompatible with reality as I understood it. "That's impossible," I said. "It happened. It's happening. Istvan was the purge, killing everyone who would have remained loyal to the Emperor, concentrating them in one place and eliminating them. The survivors are loyalists. Loken is a loyalist. The War Master intends to kill them all, then march on Terra." Cinderman gripped my arm. "Copy everything. Hide the copies. If you're questioned, lie. Tell them you've recorded nothing questionable, that you serve the War Master faithfully. Survive. Someone has to bear witness to what actually happened here." He released me and walked away quickly, his posture suggesting fear. I sat surrounded by my documentation. Hundreds of drawings, detailed observations, technical studies, portraits. Evidence of the crusade as it had been before whatever happened on Davin. Evidence of the transformation I had witnessed but not understood. I spent that night and the following 2 days copying my most crucial works, reducing them to miniature scale, hiding the copies in the seams of my clothing, in hollowed stylus cases, in the binding of archival volumes, in any location that might escape casual inspection. The siege of Istvan III lasted 123 days. I remained aboard the Vengeful Spirit, my movements increasingly restricted as the War Master's new order solidified its control. The ship's corridors changed. Iconography appeared that violated everything I understood about Imperial doctrine. 8-pointed stars, leering faces that seemed to watch from bulkheads, symbols that hurt to look at directly, that created a sensation of wrongness when I observed them. The Astartes themselves began to change. Their armor bore new marks, paint schemes incorporating colors that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. Some warriors developed visible mutations, skin that was too pale or too dark, eyes that reflected light wrongly, growths that resembled horns or blades emerging from armor joints. I drew it all. I documented the transformation with the same attention to accuracy I had brought to documenting the Crusade's victories. I sketched the new iconography, noted the mutations, recorded conversations I overheard in corridors and archive bays. I hid my documentation carefully. When questioned by security personnel or observing officers, I lied. I claimed I was drawing standard technical studies, composition exercises, portrait practice. I swore loyalty when required. I attended mandatory assemblies where the War Master explained his new vision, speeches about the weakness of the Emperor's imperial truth, about powers in the warp that could elevate humanity beyond its current limitations, about the necessity of rejecting false doctrine and embracing genuine strength. I survived because Loken had warned me, because Cinderman had advised me, because I was competent enough to be useful and careful enough not to be immediately dangerous, because the War Master's forces needed Remembrancers to document their version of events, to create the historical record that would justify their rebellion, and killing all witnesses would have created documentation gaps that would raise questions among forces not yet fully committed to the new path. The reports from Istvan the Third's surface were fragmentary but consistent. The Loyalists fought with desperate brilliance, inflicting catastrophic casualties on forces sent to eliminate them. They would not break. They would not surrender. They had fortified positions in the ruins, created supply chains from crashed ships and salvaged equipment, organized under Captains Loken, Tarvitz, and Torgadden, all warriors known for tactical skill and absolute loyalty to the Emperor. The War Master grew increasingly impatient as the siege extended far beyond projected timelines. Resources were being consumed, casualties mounting, and other operations delayed while Istvan III refused to die. He ordered virus bombing of the remaining defensive positions, atmospheric saturation with life-eater virus, total biological elimination. I was required to observe. All remembrancers still aboard the Vengeful Spirit were assembled in a ceremonial observation gallery to witness what was termed the cleansing of those who refused enlightenment. Attendance was mandatory. Armed guards ensured compliance. I stood among 43 other remembrances, all that remained of the original cohort of 70, and watched as virus bombs fell through Istvan III's atmosphere. Life-eater virus consumed organic material at molecular level. It was designed for planetary extinction events, for eliminating biospheres that were too contaminated or too dangerous to purge through conventional means. Release protocols required approval from War Master level command because the weapon was indiscriminate, because it killed everything, because it represented absolute rejection of redemption or integration. I watched the virus spread across the remaining defensive zones. The biological contamination created visible atmospheric changes. The air itself seemed to thicken, to turn gray-green, to writhe as it consumed everything organic. Then came the firestorm. Life-eater virus released chemical byproducts that were highly flammable. When atmospheric concentration reached critical threshold, any ignition source, weapons fire, active power systems, simple friction, triggered atmospheric ignition. The surface burned for the second time, and this time, truly, nothing survived. I thought of Loken down there, fighting in those ruins, believing he served the Emperor's true will, maintaining loyalty in the face of betrayal from the very forces he had trusted absolutely. I thought of his face, his questions, his humanity. I drew him from memory during the bombardment, my stylus moving while other remembrancers wept or prayed or stood in numb silence. I captured his expression of doubt, the look that made him human, the questioning intelligence that had made him different from warriors who simply obeyed. I finished the portrait as the firestorm consumed the last defensive positions, as the tactical displays confirmed 0 life signs, as Istvan III died completely. He was dead. I knew this with absolute certainty. No one survived atmospheric ignition. The temperatures were too extreme, the chemical environment too hostile, the duration too extended. Loken was dead, and with him died everyone who had stood loyal, everyone who had refused the War Master's new path. I folded my drawing small enough to hide in my palm, and I said nothing as the assembled remembrancers were dismissed back to our quarters. After Istvan III came Istvan V. 7 loyalist legions arrived in system to punish the traitors, to restore order, to execute the Emperor's justice against those who had rebelled. The War Master had anticipated this. Intelligence networks, corrupted communication channels, and planted agents had provided advance warning of the response force composition and estimated arrival time. 4 of the 7 incoming legions were corrupted, prepared to turn on their brothers in a planned betrayal. I watched the drop site massacre from orbital observation, standing in the same gallery where I had watched Istvan III burn. 7 legions deployed to the surface, Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard in the first wave, establishing beachheads and preparing for the follow-up assault. Night Lords, Iron Warriors, Word-Bearers, and Alpha Legion in the second wave, supposedly providing support and reinforcement. The first wave engaged the traitor forces, pushing toward the primary fortification zones, committing their strength in preparation for final assault. Then the second wave opened fire on the first wave. The betrayal was total. Night Lords, Iron Warriors, Word-Bearers, and Alpha Legion turned their weapons on their supposed allies, catching the Loyalist forces between traitor armies ahead and traitor armies behind. The killing was efficient and comprehensive. Tens of thousands of Astartes died in the first hour. The Primarchs themselves fought. I watched through long-range pick capture as Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands dueled Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, as Vulcan of the Salamanders was overwhelmed by Word-Bearers, as Korax of the Raven Guard attempted to organize fighting retreat, while his legion died around him. The massacre continued for 7 hours. When it ended, 3 legions were effectively destroyed as fighting forces. Ferrus Manus was dead, his head taken as trophy by the traitors. Vulcan and Korax survived, though their legions were shattered, scattered survivors fleeing into Istvan V's wilderness pursued by traitor forces. The War Master had destroyed his opposition systematically. The rebellion was complete. Half the legions had declared for him, and the Loyalist forces capable of immediate response were eliminated. I understood then that I would likely die. The Imperium the War Master intended to build would not value accurate record-keeping of his crimes. Truth would be whatever he declared it. My testimony was dangerous. My drawings were evidence of transformation and betrayal. I debated destroying my entire archive, burning everything to remove the risk, but I could not. If I destroyed the record, Loken's death meant nothing. Sejanus's death meant nothing. The 74,000 who died in the first bombardment vanished without trace, their sacrifice erased, their loyalty forgotten. I could not permit that. I retained the archive. I hid it more carefully. I waited. The War Master summoned all remaining remembrancers 3 weeks after the drop site massacre. 43 of us assembled in a chamber deep in the vengeful spirit's core, a space I had never entered before. The walls were inscribed with symbols that created physical discomfort when observed, that seemed to writhe at the edge of vision. The air tasted of copper and something sweet that made my stomach turn, that suggested organic decay and chemical corruption. The temperature fluctuated, sometimes cold enough that my breath misted, sometimes hot enough that sweat beaded on my skin. The War Master entered, and he was no longer maintaining the appearance of Horus Lupercal. His armor was changed, incorporating elements that seemed almost organic, that suggested fusion of machine and flesh. His eyes held light that came from no natural source, a glow that shifted color when I tried to focus on it. His presence pressed against my mind like physical force, like hands pushing into my thoughts, searching for resistance or doubt or disloyalty. He spoke of the new age. He spoke of powers beyond the Emperor's understanding, of truths the imperial doctrine had hidden to maintain control, of the weakness of denying humanity's spiritual nature and the strength available to those who embraced the gods of the warp. He spoke with absolute conviction, with charisma that was no longer human warmth but something else, something that compelled attention and agreement through mechanisms I could not identify. Half the remembrancers in the chamber knelt willingly, swearing loyalty immediately, begging to serve the new order with the fervor of religious converts. The other half stood silent. I stood among them, keeping my face neutral, my thoughts carefully blank. The War Master's gaze swept across us. It stopped on me. For 3 seconds that felt much longer. He looked directly at me, and I felt his attention like hooks in my brain, pulling, searching, testing. I forced my expression into submission. I bowed my head. I thought of nothing, deliberately blanked my mind, focused on breathing and heartbeat and the physical sensation of standing. The attention moved on, selecting other targets, probing other minds. Those who will not serve willingly, the War Master said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to vibrate in bone rather than air, will serve anyway. You have witnessed the transformation. You will bear testimony to its necessity. Your records will be preserved, properly interpreted, to demonstrate the inevitability of our path. You will be kept as resources. You will be maintained until your utility expires. Astarte's warriors, standing along the chamber walls, their armor bearing the new iconography, their expressions suggesting they were no longer entirely sane, seized those of us who had not knelt. 21 remembrancers. I did not resist. Resistance meant immediate death, and death meant my testimony died with me. I was pulled from the chamber, taken through corridors that seemed wrong, that created disorientation and nausea, to the ship's brig. My cell was 3 meters square. Rock-crete walls, a cot that folded from the wall, a waste disposal unit, a single light source that never dimmed. I was given water twice daily, nutrient paste once daily, and nothing else. 20 other remembrancers were imprisoned in adjacent cells. I never learned what happened to those who had knelt in the War Master's presence. I never saw them again. I spent 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days aboard the vengeful spirit in that cell. I tracked time by counting meal deliveries, by monitoring my body's degradation, by observing the subtle vibrations that indicated warp translation or real space maneuvering. The ship traveled constantly. I felt the characteristic shudder of warp entry and the heavier vibration of warp exit, suggesting campaign after campaign, battle after battle. I heard fragments of news from the guards who brought meals. Terra besieged, the Emperor wounded but alive, the War Master killed in personal combat with the Emperor. The heresy, they were calling it the Horus Heresy now, was over. The traitors fled to the Eye of Terror. The Imperium survived but was transformed, broken into new organizational structures, processing trauma on civilizational scale. In my cell, I hid my most critical drawings in the seams of my clothing, in my body when necessary, in structural gaps I discovered in the cell's construction. I drew on scraps when I could acquire them, usually bits of packaging from the nutrient paste containers. I drew from memory when I could not acquire materials, tracing images on the walls with my fingernail, creating impressions too faint to be visible but tactilely distinct. I drew Loken until I could reproduce his face perfectly from imagination. He became my measure of what the Imperium had lost, what the heresy had cost. As long as I could remember his face, his questions, his humanity, the record remained intact. The war ended. I was transferred to Terra, to a detention facility beneath the Imperial Palace, into the bureaucratic machinery that would maintain me for the next 3 centuries. Not released, not executed, maintained. I learned the reasoning from an interrogator during my first session on Terra. My testimony might be required. My observations might contain intelligence value regarding traitor force composition, tactical doctrine, or command personalities. I would be kept until such determination could be made, until tribunals were established, until the Imperium decided whether my knowledge was valuable or simply dangerous. Kept meant imprisoned. The cell on Terra was larger than the one aboard the Vengeful Spirit. 5 meters square, with a cot and a desk and a single armored window that showed nothing but other prison buildings. I was given drawing materials, required to produce documentation of everything I had witnessed. I complied. I produced hundreds of pages over the first 5 years. Accurate images, careful timelines, precise observations of the 16th Legion's transformation. I gave them truth within careful limits. I confirmed dates, described events, provided details that could be verified through other sources. I did not give them everything. The most critical works remained hidden. Months became years, years became decades. The interrogations continued at irregular intervals, sometimes monthly, sometimes not for years. Different interrogators, same questions. What had I witnessed? When had the corruption manifested? Had I observed any indication before Istvan? I answered truthfully within boundaries I had established. I became expert at saying much while revealing little, at providing information that seemed comprehensive while withholding the most dangerous truths. No one came for my critical testimony. No tribunal summoned me. No official hearing required my complete documentation. The Imperium was reorganizing, fracturing into the administratum and the ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition and a dozen other power structures. Remembrancer's observations were irrelevant to that massive process. I continued to be maintained because the administrative structure maintaining me persisted, not because anyone actively valued my existence. I was a file, a number in a database, a resource that might theoretically have utility, and therefore could not be disposed of without proper authorization. I turned 50 standard years in my cell, then 60, then 70. My hands developed tremors that made detailed work increasingly difficult. My vision degraded, requiring augmetic assistance. I requested medical intervention. I was provided with basic rejuvenate treatments, enough to keep me functional, not enough to reverse the fundamental decay of aging. The Imperium was investing minimally in my continued utility. At 83 standard, I received a new interrogator. He was young, perhaps 30, with the bearing of minor nobility and the insignia of the Ordo Hereticus, an organization that had not existed when I was first imprisoned. He reviewed my file with obvious distaste. "You've been here 62 years, he said. "Yes. You were embedded with traitor forces during the heresy. I was embedded with imperial forces that became traitor forces. I did not participate in their treason. Yet you survived. Suspicious." I said nothing. Silence often served better than defense. He leaned forward. "Your records indicate comprehensive documentation of the 16th Legion's fall. This documentation has never been formally reviewed by appropriate authorities." "Why?" "You would need to ask those authorities." "I'm asking you." "Then I don't know. I was told my testimony might be required. I've waited. It has not been required." He studied me with the cold assessment of someone who had seen horror, but not suffered it. "The Imperium is purging all heresy-era documentation. Too much corruption, too much risk of mimetic infection. Your records will be destroyed." Something in my chest clenched. My records are accurate. Accuracy is not the concern. Contamination is. I witnessed. You witnessed treason and corruption. Recording it does not make you valuable. It makes you a vector. He stood. "Your continued maintenance serves no purpose. You will be terminated within the month. Your documentation will be incinerated unread." He left. I sat in my cell, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. Terminated. Everything I had preserved, everything I had hidden, everything I had suffered to maintain, destroyed, unread. Loken's face erased, the truth of Istvan incinerated. The Imperium would continue without acknowledging what it had cost, what it had become. The month passed. No termination occurred. Then a year, then 5, then 10. I turned 100. My body failed despite rejuvenate treatments. I requested termination. The request was denied without explanation. I was being maintained. I did not know why. I no longer cared to understand. I existed for 2 more centuries in various cells, transferred between facilities, questioned occasionally, kept alive through increasingly extensive medical intervention. My body became machinery, and failing organs sustained by machinery. My mind was trauma looping endlessly, memory degrading, identity dissolving into the function of testimony. I was no longer a person. I was an archive, maintained because disposing of archives required proper authorization, and I was too insignificant to merit anyone filing the necessary paperwork. I died at 304 standard years. Comprehensive organ failure. Life support systems could no longer compensate. I felt consciousness fragment, felt awareness dissolve into scattered processes. I thought of Loken's face one final time, tried to hold the image clear. It would not hold. Details slipped away, corrupted, lost to centuries of degradation. They destroyed my body. They incinerated my official documentation unread. My file was marked closed, my hidden archive. I do not know if it survived. Perhaps someone found the miniature drawings. Perhaps they are ash. Perhaps they still exist somewhere in the depth of the Imperial Palace, testimony waiting for a witness who will never come. This is what the Imperium costs. Not just the dead, not just the suffering. The cost is this. I bore witness to the heresy. I recorded the truth. I preserved testimony through 3 centuries of imprisonment. It mattered to no one. It changed nothing. The Imperium continued without my truth, without my testimony, without acknowledgement of what was lost or what was sacrificed. Loken questioned. He doubted. He tried to understand. That made him human. That got him killed. I recorded his humanity perfectly. It mattered to exactly no one. I testified. This is my testimony. I do not know if anyone receives it. I exist now only as degraded archive, as memory processed through corrupted systems. But I testified. I bore witness. The Imperium continued without it. The Imperium always continues.